This lecture is about slavery in the colonies, particularly looking at the British colonies. We are jumping ahead a little bit because we will be most concerned with the British colonies. But so the first part of the chart to really know is that the first Africans who arrive in America, there are some slaves. Most arrive as indentured servants. So in the beginning, slavery started out more as an indentured servitude, like kind of like a European would have gone through, where it was a limited amount of time. Their children were not enslaved, and they're at a certain point, they gain their freedom after the amount of time. But that quickly changes. But again, those first Africans generally were more like an indentured servant, even though there was still some racism between the indentured servants and Africans. We're going to look at why we see this switch in the 13 colonies, the 13 British colonies, and elsewhere, to use more enslaved labor rather than indentured labor. So one is that by the 1600s and then 1700s, definitely by the 1700s, there aren't as many indentured servants. So the problem of unemployment had really dropped. That unemployment problem that we had talked about in some of the first lectures, where lots of poor Europeans were willing to come over as indentured servants because there just wasn't any opportunity in Europe. That problem has really ended, so there's not as many indentured servants. Two is that those indentured servants that were coming were not, the Europeans were not immune to a lot of the diseases that were in North America. So a big problem was malaria. A lot of the areas where the hard labor was, where they needed indentured servants, were in the Carolinas, for example, where they had a lot of rice paddies and a lot of malaria. There were a lot of mosquitoes in the south, and so a lot of the Europeans were dying, indentured servants were dying from these diseases. Malaria is present in Africa, and so the indentured servants, slaves, laborers who were coming over from Africa were more immune to these diseases than the European laborers. Next is this event called Bacon's Rebellion that you can see here, and this was a vastly complicated rebellion that you'll learn about more when you do your reading in Howard Zinn. But one of the components of this rebellion was mostly a rebellion about kind of the income gap and treatment of indentured servants in the lower classes. But part of that component is that the indentured servants, part of them were rising up, some of them with enslaved labor. But it made the planter class, people that own these plantations, really afraid of indentured servants in particular, and also their indentured slaves. And so it made them realize that they needed a much more controllable workforce. And so slaves held for a lifetime, children that were enslaved, they realized that they needed to move away from this workforce that might rebel, that maybe thought they had rights, to ones that they could completely control and demoralize, unfortunately. And then the last reason is this rising belief in racism. So racism isn't something that has always existed. The idea of racial superiority started to come out, and you see this idea of the word racism coming out in this time period, this colonization time period, where Europeans felt like they were superior to others, to Native Americans, to Africans, etc. And again, this is a new idea, and it also helped them believe that they could enslave somebody else. Again, before this, slavery had really been more about conquest in war. So Greeks might enslave other Europeans, or a lot of the Arab invaders from the Middle East would enslave Africans, or Africans would enslave others. And it was not about racial superiority, it was about war and conquest. And so you see again this switch in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s in slavery being about race rather than being about war and conquest and things like that. And so again, that ties into why you see this switch. So looking at just the 13 colonies, the British colonies, very briefly, Massachusetts which is maybe surprising to some. Massachusetts up north was the very first colony to legalize the owning of another human being. So they're the ones who legalized slavery. By the 1700s, every single colony, every single one of the British colonies had slavery and had legalized it. They had also legalized the enslavement of any children born of the slaves. And so that was something new, is that again, before this, the children weren't slaves. At this point in the 1700s, the children are. They're allowed to break up families, sell away a wife or sell away a husband, sell away the children, all of this legalized. One of the problems for control and things like that is in the South, slaves made up a majority of the population. So there were more slaves than there were Europeans. And so this led to a problem of, well, if by a majority, if the slaves decided to revolt, they would have been the majority over the Europeans. And we'll talk about, in later units, a major slave revolution that happens in Haiti, where hundreds and thousands of Europeans were murdered. Again, this fear within the 13 colonies of slave revolt is kind of dominant, and so they invent more and more hideous ways of controlling the slave population to prevent revolt. And so some of the kind of key terms that you'll hear in regards to the slave trade that we'll talk about. One is the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage refers to that time crossing the Atlantic. This is the most brutal part of the voyage of the slave trade. You can see pictures here of what it was like. This is probably a generous image. Generally, the slaves could not sit up. They were more shackled, like kind of you can see down here on the bottom, where slaves were tied to the ground. They could only lay in place. They couldn't sit up. Generally, the ceiling was not as high as you can see here. It was only usually a few feet above them. There was no place to go to the bathroom. Women during their menstrual cycle, vomit, seasickness, illness, all of that was there, and they're kind of lying in it. So the fatality was very high on the Middle Passage. People dying of illness, etc. And then things contracted on that Middle Passage. Starvation, malnutrition. Again, treatment was not very good. So that's the Middle Passage. The triangular trade refers to the image that you can see here, and that was the trade from North America to Europe and to Africa, back over to South America, to the Caribbean, to North America. And so you can see kind of the different triangles of what was being traded. From North America was generally things like whale oil, lumber, rum, etc. Going to Europe, if there's things going to Africa, were more grains, lumber, rum. Those items were traded for slaves. Those slaves were then sent either directly to North America or more often to the Caribbean. So the Caribbean really was the main destination for most slaves. The sugar plantations down in the Caribbean and South America required much more slaves. The fatality was higher. So I think the lifetime expectancy of a slave heading to the Caribbean to a sugar plantation was 7 years at most. Much different from slaves heading to North America, for example. So again, much more brutal in the Caribbean, and way more ended up there. So that sometimes is a question on the AP test, is that, again, most ended up in the Caribbean, not in North America. And then finally, we'll look at kind of some of the resistances. We'll go into much more detail in a couple of units, but there obviously was a lot of resistance to the treatment and enslavement of Africans by the people themselves. And so there was obviously escape. That was an option. This usually led to brutal treatment if they were caught. There were people that were slave catchers. There were people that were then beaten, mutilated, had to wear all kinds of contraptions around them to show that they had escaped. Branding, the punishment for escape was rather high and made that risk of taking it too much, too great for some, but some did take that risk. It took a long time for the Underground Railroad to develop. That's after the Revolution, to help slaves escape. And so in the 1600s, 1700s, that was much harder. Those that did escape frequently went to the maroon communities, which you see down the list. Maroon communities were for people where had escaped slaves, kind of set up in the deep forest, down into the swamps and things like that, and it's where slaves who'd escaped would hide. A lot of times they mixed with Native Americans or joined Native American tribes, and so those are known as maroon colonies. There was also self-mutilation, so slaves would hurt themselves so that they couldn't work. But the most popular one, and this is what AP will ask about, was slowdown. So they couldn't be beaten for escaping or mutilating themselves or something like that. It was less overt and thus the most popular, but it's where they would just work very, very slowly. And so this hurt the owners economically, but it wasn't obvious that they were doing it necessarily, and so thus they could resist without maybe necessarily taking on the risk of being beaten or killed, things like that. So as far as the arguments for and against slavery, even though slavery was legal in all of the colonies, it wasn't a done deal. There was a lot of debate over it, especially in the North, about if slavery should even be in the colonies. We're going to talk about that debate in class. So you can leave those two blank. And that's it for the lecture.